Welcoming you to a life of awareness, the Presence Project is excited for you to join us for today's podcast with your host, Paul Kersner.
Hello and welcome to episode 98 of Are You Being Present? My name is Paul. I want to welcome you to the present moment. I want to welcome you to the here and now. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly, sincerely, and deeply for joining me in this amazing present moment. The title and topic for today's podcast is Obligation is a Tool of the Ego. This is a topic that I speak of often with patients. It's certainly a topic that I think about when I'm sitting with myself and I'm reviewing or observing my ego, when I'm making the most of my present moments. I'm looking at a tool, I'm looking at a word, I'm looking at an energy in regard to obligation. Obligation is a tool, and it's a tool that the ego uses against you, against me, against all of us. It's woven within the fabric of the third dimensional matrix, within societal programming. It is a negative motivator, and we've spoken many times about negative motivators and how we need to remove them, perhaps eradicate them out of our psyche, because we will never get to a positive place using a negative motivator, yet we're raised to believe the opposite. We're raised to believe that we need to use negative motivators to motivate us, and all that does is create self-inflicted suffering. All it does is remove us from the present moment. All it does is imbue us with negativity. And that's not helpful at all, especially when we're trying to remain neutral or objective in any given present moment. But let's focus on obligation, where it comes from, how it's used, more importantly, and the effects that obligation has on our present moment and also on our well-being. Obligation is, in a sense, a responsibility, but it's a responsibility that you have no choice but to do. It's almost as if you're forced to do it. You're obliged to do this. And when we do things that we don't want to do, but we do them anyway, it builds resentment and resistance. And in a previous podcast, I talked about the effects that resentment and resistance have on the present moment, because they are ultimately presence obstructions. So as we're obliged to do something that we don't want to do, we are willfully or unknowingly, possibly, removing us from the present moment. And that's a very tough and challenging experience for many of us, because we grow up being told that we are obligated to do all these different things, and more often than not we don't want to do them, but we find that we don't have a choice. And ultimately that creates a lot of pressure, that creates a lot of suffering. The ego thrives in that arena when we're doing things that we don't want to do, because it's observing us, and the state of resistance and resentment grows incrementally and then exponentially and becomes like a pressure cooker. That's exactly where you're going to find the ego, and the ego is going to support that loop. You know, that voice in your head is going to be right there when you're doing whatever activity that you don't ultimately want to do for whomever you don't want to do it for. This is a very challenging position for many of us who are in situations where we feel obligated to serve others or to accomplish things that we don't want to do. And I wanted to take time with you and share my present seconds to touch upon this very topic, about how we can reframe obligation so that we can ultimately shift into a more neutral state of being, even though we are obligated to do certain things at certain times for certain people. This podcast is always about teaching you ways on how to be present by giving you presence tools, by helping you shift your perceptions and perspectives. Shifting your perspective and your perception on the term obligation is extremely important when you're on the path to creating a more present life. And that's done using presence tools, having a mindfulness practice, being the observer. And if you're the observer, when you feel that you're being forced to do something, you're going to notice that there's a lot of resistance, resentment, and negativity that is going to be flushing over your entire being in mind, body, and spirit. That is certainly not going to be healthy for you, and you're certainly not going to be able to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish to the best of your abilities because you don't ultimately want to do it. So you might be wondering where I'm leading you to right now. And that is to a place where we could be more neutral with the things that we do. You always have a choice. That is ultimately the way that we want to see this. And even though you feel that you are obligated to do whatever it is that you're doing that you don't want to do, you can change the way that you're doing it, and you could choose to do it just because it will alleviate a lot of the pressure that you're experiencing right now, and that's just creating a lot of self-inflicted suffering. It's not helpful, and by changing your perceptions about what you're doing and how you're doing it, it will provide for more presence and ultimately more peace and prosperity. I know this is challenging for many of you because you felt that you've had to do a lot of things that you didn't want to do in the present moment. It didn't feel fair. It's not fair, but life isn't fair. By doing your work, by being more present and being the observer, we can alleviate a lot of the pressure that you're experiencing while you're doing and accomplishing whatever it is that you feel obligated to do. So by reframing the term obligation, we're alleviating a lot of the pressure that you're experiencing throughout your day, because you're ultimately choosing to do those things instead of resenting or resisting them. And you'll notice that as you shift your perceptions and perspectives in terms of obligation, you'll start to feel a lot lighter in regards to what you're doing and when you're doing it, and it'll allow you to be more present. It doesn't mean that you're ultimately going to like what you're doing, and you don't necessarily have to. But if it has to get done, why not choose to do it in a way that you feel neutral about it instead of resenting or resisting it while you're doing it? Because all that's doing is creating pressure and ejecting you from the present moment while you're thinking about all the other things you want to do, all the other places that you want to be. This is a very important topic and milestone for you and for me to touch upon, because we're all obligated to do things that we don't necessarily want to do. And ultimately, they have to get done. And because they have to get done, we could shift the way that we're doing it. And that's why I'm really hammering in your ability and necessity to reframe the word and the way you see obligation. Of course, this isn't going to be easy because it's rooted so deeply within your psyche. I get it. It's taken me a lot of time to reframe my obligations or the way that I'm doing things. But it's a worthy endeavor, and it takes time, and it's certainly a lot of commitment to wanting to shift into a more neutral state of being, into shifting into a more present state of being. And I will tell you honestly that the work that I've done and the efforts that I put in to reframe the way I see and perceive obligation has alleviated a lot of the self-inflicted suffering that I've experienced at the hands of my ego. And ultimately you will too, as you do your work in regards to obligation, being obligated or responsible to taking care of things that are adverse or really not something that you would have chosen to do in the first place. So by shifting the way you're doing it and by choosing to do it, you'll be able to be more present. You'll be able to suffer less at the hands of your ego. You'll be able to stay in that flow state and gain momentum and just feel better about your day, your moments, your seconds, and not feel that pressure and suffer at the hands of your ego. Because if you're choosing to do something, then you could stay neutral about it. And if you're neutral, then you could be the observer of your ego. And if you're the observer of your ego, you don't have to be the victim of your ego. And it works just like that. But again, it definitely takes a level of commitment. And it certainly is going to take you some time to want to even address the term obligation, or the way that, at least the way that you see it, so that you can relieve yourself of all the programming that's been imbued within you as you have grown up, as you've been indoctrinated into societal programming. Because obligation is certainly something that's considered normal within this dimension, and especially with the programming that you've been given and that I've been given. So I hope that this podcast has been helpful to address that programming so you can uproot it and shift it so that you don't have to suffer while you're doing the things that you have to do ultimately. And because you have to do it, why not choose to do it instead of feeling obligated to do it? Why not shift into a more neutral and present state of being so that you can stop suffering? I know that this is a very challenging topic, and I know that many of you are going to stumble, and that's okay. I could tell you honestly, in the beginning when I started doing this work on obligation, I found it very challenging and adverse to the way that I wanted to operate. But I realized that there are just certain things that need to happen. And why don't I start choosing to do these things instead of feeling so bad about them and that I'm being forced to do something that I don't want to do, that I'm not choosing to do. So I hope that you found this podcast helpful. I hope that you'll take some time to think about the term obligation, the fact that you feel obligated, where that comes from, how heavy that feels, and how important it's going to be when you're able to reframe the term and the word obligation and obligated so that it could feel more neutral so ultimately you could be more present.
Thank you for listening to the Are You Being Present podcast, brought to you by the Presence Projects. Remember, you have a choice. Choose to be present.